Hey, this is Mr. Worski, and today we are going to start our journey through the wonderful world of plants. I know, exciting, right? So if you have any questions, don't forget you can pause the slideshow to make sure you get all the information down. You can also read the textbook, review the video, or ask me in class tomorrow. So there are 280,000 species of plants. Now, how are these species defined? Primarily by their cellulose cell wall. So you know how fungus were defined by a chitin cell wall. Plants have a cellulose cell wall. Most are photosynthetic, not all. Most are non-motile, they have specialized tissue. They produce cutin and have the stomata. Some produce other secondary compounds like lignin, which makes wood, poisons, all that sort of stuff. So we need to remember that when moving from oceans to land, there had to be 4 problems that needed to be solved by plants. First was desiccation, which means that they dry out. 2, support. 3, swimming sperm. That's a big one, right? Sperm can't walk. They can only swim. And 4, obtaining minerals and removing wastes. Now, there are 10 plant divisions. See, the problem is that these botanists, they don't go by the current classification system. They don't go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. They go kingdom and then division. So a phylum for them is a division. So when I say there are 10 plant divisions, that means there are 10 plant phyla. Don't know why, they're botanists. So there are Bryophyta, Hepatophyta, and Xerophyta. My gosh, those are all non-vascular plants. We'll spend a little bit of time, not a lot. Lycophyta, Pterophyta, Ginkgophyta, Cycadophyta, Cnidophyta, Coniferophyta, and Anthophyta. Those are all vascular plants. Now remember, we're only going to focus on a few good representatives of the phyla and of plants themselves. So let's get going. So we're going to start talking about non-vascular, and we'll talk about what vascular means in a moment. But the bryophytes is the phylum, and the class is Muscae, which is moss. They do have specialized tissue, rhizoids, central cylinders, leaf scales, antheridium, and archegonium. Right? Rhizoids, like the fungus, will grow down into the soil. The central cylinder is the central part. Leaf scales, they look like leaves. And in antheridium and archegonium, you've heard about them before. Those produce the sperm and produce the egg. They produce cutin, which is a waxy substance that prevents desiccation. Now, how do they solve the problems of gravity, desiccation, water, minerals, and sperm? Well, they didn't. Right? They didn't, and they didn't, and they didn't. So these things are really small. They didn't grow that big. They have cutin, but they need to be in moist environments or else you'll have dead moss. They need water for minerals and waste. And the sperm, well, their sperm still swims, so in order for moss to reproduce, they need water, rain, something. That's green moss. So the reproduction, they have a haploid spore that grows into a moss. Now, that is what you see, the green stuff is a dominant gametophyte. They produce gametes. All right. Now they're the only plant that has a dominant gametophyte. Usually the gametophytes are really small, can't really see that much, but in moss, that's pretty much all you see is the gametophyte. There are 2 types of moss. You have a male moss. I used to teach a student, Eddie Moss. He was a male moss. And then you have a female moss. I'm sorry, phi individual moss. The male moss has an antheridium. Phi individual moss has an archegonium. So when it rains, the sperm can go from the antheridium to the archegonium, and then that will fertilize the egg in the archegonium. The fertilized egg, they produce a sporophyte. Okay, the sporophyte produces spores. Now the spores that they produce, the diploid cells, they undergo meiosis, so they produce haploid spores, which will grow into haploid gametophytes. So we have antheridium here is at the top, archegonium here. Now this is the moss, right? We have beautiful, and we have the pictures at the top. Now this is the male moss. This is the female moss. Then when it rains, the sperm will go from here to the archegonium, and then it will form this sporophyte here at the top, and that will produce haploid spores through meiosis, and then they will grow into these beautiful lush green moss. Hey, there's more moss reproduction here, gang. We have the spores. They grow into gametophytes. We have male, female, water, swim, fertilize, grows into a sporophyte. The spore, this big thing here, sporophyte will produce haploid spores, which will grow into the gametophytes. So sporophyte, gametophyte. Now the gametophyte is the dominant generation. You see gametophytes, rarely see sporophytes. The only plant like that, remember, dominant gametophyte. Vascular plants have vascular tissue. Non-vascular plants don't. So there's two types of vascular tissue. We have xylem. It's not exhalem. It's xylem. Xylem will move water up a plant to the leaves where photosynthesis happens. You need water for photosynthesis to replace the electrons, and breakdown of water produces oxygen. Hope you remember that. Phloem will move the photosynthetic products, the glucose, down the plant to the cells so that they can undergo aerobic respiration. Getting a little ahead of myself. Now, vascular plants have true roots, stems, and leaves. We have pictures of xylem and phloem right here. We have xylem, cells that act as tubes, giant straws, and then phloem. Xylem, phloem, they look similar? They do. So in vascular plants, we're going to start off with Pterophyta. And Pterophyta are ferns. Not really going to mention Lycophyta. Those are club mosses. They look like little pine trees in the forest. Pterophyta, the class is Pteridopsida, and those are ferns. They have 12,000 species. They have a horizontal root underground called a rhizome, and those from that underground root, you'll have little fiddleheads that are young ferns, and they unfurl, like those little party things you blow into, and they unroll and they come out and they make that little funny sound. Well, that's what a fiddlehead looks like. It resembles the head of a fiddle, but that's what it looks like. Now the fern that we see is the sporophyte. So it is a dominant sporophyte. And under the fern, you will see these little circles, which is called a sorus, and it'd be multiple, so it'll be a sori. The cells will in the sorus, those are your, they will produce haploid spores through meiosis, and those spores will spread, and then they will grow and form something known as a prothallium, and a prothallium is a gametophyte. Right, so we have these big sporophytes, and they produce spores that produce the tiny little gametophytes, and you're going to see them in class. You can actually look at them through a microscope. That's how small they are. Now you have male and female, and the male produces a sperm in the antheridia. Females or female individuals produce the egg in the archegonia. You need rain, so the sperm still needs to swim to the egg. Is that sperm swill? Sperms will swim to the egg. I think will swim is swill now. The egg is fertilized, forms a diploid sporophyte, which grows into a fiddlehead and a giant fern. That's a fiddlehead, and these are the ferns here. And here's the life cycle. So we have these haploid spores. They form these haploid prothallium. Prothallium is the heart-shaped structure. There's male prothallium and female prothallium. We have egg and sperm. They swim to each other to produce a sporophyte, which is a fern. Remember, if you need to pause this to draw these pictures, please do so. Now, seed plants produce seeds. Notice that the ferns didn't produce seeds, they produce spores. Now, Ginkgophyta, there's only one species of Ginkgophyta. They have fan-shaped leaves, and they lose their leaves all on one day. That's where you go, Ginkgo biloba. Cycadophyta, they have a large cone. They live in tropical regions. Not really going to talk about them. You can look them up sometime. They're kind of cool. We have Coniferophyta. They have cones. We know about cones. There are 550 species. They have needle-like leaves. There are two types of cones. We have male cones, and those are the small cones at the end of the branches. And then you have female cones, which are large cones in the center of the tree. Now, this is a huge evolutionary event. You cannot understate this, but we have the formation of pollen. Pollen is sperm. Plant sperm is pollen. And the big thing is you do not need water to reproduce anymore because the pollen can be carried by the wind, by different animals, by water to the female cone. So you don't need water to reproduce anymore. Pollen is the plant sperm. So in reproduction, we have the gametophytes, which are really small now. Those are the cones. They produce the gametes, right? Before in ferns, you had a separate organism. Now you have the gametophyte actually on the sporophyte. Okay, so the male cones produce sperm through meiosis. They have a tough coat put around them, sporopollenin, and they're carried by the wind to the female cone. Now the female cone has an egg that it produces through meiosis. Now only one egg, and instead of having 4 eggs, they only have 1, so only 1 egg survives, 3 disintegrate. The female cone is sticky. You notice you picked up a pine tree or pine cone when it's really young and green, it's really sticky. Well, that's to catch the pollen that's being carried to it by the wind. Now it takes about a year for the sperm to fertilize the egg inside the cone. Eventually fertilization will happen. The diploid cell will divide to form a baby. Mom adds some food and you have a seed, because a seed is a baby with a lunch. We have here the big one, we get the small one, right? The pollen lands, fertilizes, divides. We have a baby here, we have some food up here, and then it'll float away and land and grow into a big tree, which is your sporophyte, which will produce these smaller gametophytes on top of the sporophyte. If you want, we can talk about sporophytes and gametophytes in class tomorrow. The conifer leaf, about 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter, has an epidermis, which is the outer layer, protects. Photosynthetic cells, which undergo photosynthesis. Beautiful. We have the stomata. Now, the stomata are holes in the outer portion of the leaf, which allows gas exchange. Carbon dioxide can enter for photosynthesis, and oxygen can leave, which is a result of photosynthesis. The vein is both the xylem and phloem. We talked about what they do. Xylem carries water, phloem carries the photosynthetic products down. And then we have resin ducts. Now, the resin ducts, they believe, acts like a band-aid. So if there's some type of injury to the leaf, the resin is produced to seal up the injury. Now, Anthophyta they are flowering plants. Now, there are 250,000 species of flowering plants, and there are 2 classes. So we have the phyla, Anthophyta, class monocotyledons, which are known as monocots, or class dicotyledons, which are known as dicots. What is the difference between monocot and dicot? Well, this is a table that goes over the difference, and I want you to get this table in your notes. Leaf veins parallel or net-like. Cotyledon, which is the first thing that breaks the ground, and I can't believe that happened, 1, in dicots 2. Roots, you have net-like or you have a main taproot. Floral parts, that's parts of the flower, multiples of 3, multiples of 4 or 5. Vascular bundles are scattered or they're organized. Secondary growth, that means you get wider, and I did it again. Wider, and secondary growth in monocots is usually absent. In dicots, it's usually present, so dicots can get wider. Hit pause, get this table down. Hit pause now. Now after you hit pause, you get back here, what we're talking about, like the flower, the petals are multiples of 5, these are multiples of 3, the veins in parallel where they're net-like, main taproot, not a main taproot. Okay, we have vascular bundles are scattered throughout, these are organized. Cotyledons, we have 2 cotyledons, 2.5, or 1 cotyledon, which is the baby that breaks through. Now we will stop there because I'm going to talk about the flower tomorrow. If you have any questions, please review the video, read your textbook, or ask me tomorrow in class. Have a good night.